Welcome to Heart of the West, where every mark tells a tale. The merciless sun bore down on Clay Ridge's dusty streets, a frontier town desperately clinging to its facade of respectability like a desperate man grasps for salvation. In the town's center, a makeshift platform rose from the earth, not built for livestock or speeches, but for human commerce disguised as justice. Townsfolk had gathered in anticipation. Shopkeepers, prospectors, and ladies in starched dresses with tongues sharper than their Sunday silverware, all drawn to witness the downfall of a woman who dared challenge their world. Maria occupied that platform, her wrists loosely restrained, wearing a dress that spoke of nights spent on charity floors and borrowed kindness. 25 summers had weathered her face, 5 years of widowhood without the blessing of children's circumstances. That sealed her fate in a town that measured women by their fertility. Presenting Maria Gray, the auctioneer bellowed to the crowd. Bankrupt, troublemaker, and matrimonial disappointment, available for purchase to settle her outstanding obligations. Cruel laughter rippled through the assembly. Someone spat, "Foolish." Woman thought she could squeeze gold from the mining company after her man died in their tunnels. Another voice hissed, "Cursed Barren ground 5 years married and her womb stayed empty. Heavens reject and our burden now." Maria's expression remained stone cold. Her husband had perished when Shaft 3 caved in, crushed beneath rotted timber the company had refused to replace. She liquidated everything, their home, her wedding band, every possession of value, just to hire legal counsel from Cheyenne. Justice had been her only desire. Instead, she found bankruptcy, and when coin couldn't cover her debts, they offered her flesh as payment. Opening bid of $5. The auctioneer announced, "For capable hands, quick wit, and a tongue that speaks too freely." Silence stretched uncomfortably. "Scrawny as a scarecrow," someone jeered. "She'll collapse before noon," another added viciously. "Worthless as a dried well, even her own husband couldn't plant life in that soil." Maria swallowed her shame, but kept her spine rigid. "Let them spew their poison, may they choke on it." Then came the rhythmic thunder of approaching hooves from the eastern trail. The crowd's attention shifted as a tall figure on horseback emerged, followed by 6 children, some mounted on small ponies, others walking with silent grace. Their clothing of soft leather and earth-toned fabric marked them immediately. Comanche, the man dismounted at the square's edge. Weather and hardship had carved deep lines into his face as he secured his horse and approached, his children following like loyal shadows behind him. "What business does that savage have here?" a miner snarled. "He's got no right in civilized proceedings." The stranger ignored their hostility, his gaze fixed solely on Maria. Behind him, the children clustered together, the smallest, a girl barely 5 years old, clutching her brother's hand while staring up at the platform with wide, curious eyes. "Turn around and leave, heathen!" someone shouted. "This is white man's justice." Several men reached for tools, stepping forward menacingly. The children tensed but held their ground. Maria's heart clenched when the youngest girl looked up and offered the tiniest wave of her small hand. The man positioned himself before the auctioneer. "I offer my horse in trade for her freedom," he declared, his voice quiet but unwavering. The square erupted in mockery. "A mangy horse for that?" a rancher howled. "Maybe throw in your saddle for good measure." The crowd's laughter grew cruel. "She ain't worth a bucket of dung," an elderly woman declared, but the man Lone Elk remained unmoved. He gestured toward his Appaloosa, a magnificent animal whose healthy coat gleamed despite the commotion, muscles rippling beneath flawless hide. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Lone Elk, is it? What possible use could you have for her? She's nothing but debt, litigation, and empty promises." Lone Elk's eyes found Maria's. His voice softened without losing its conviction. "I raised 6 children alone. They require tenderness, compassion. I don't need her body for procreation, I need her soul to heal their hearts." A heavy silence fell over the square. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. "Anyone else care to outbid a horse? Anyone at all?" Not a soul spoke. One man spat contemptuously in the dirt. Another turned away in disgust. "Very well," the auctioneer conceded. "Deal accepted. Take her and be gone from Clay Ridge before sunset." As Maria's bonds were cut away, the rope burning her wrists, she remained frozen. Slowly, she descended from the platform while the crowd parted without ceremony. Lone Elk didn't extend his hand in assistance, he simply waited patiently. She studied him, then the children. The littlest girl now stood at the front, her eyes bright with hope rather than fear. Maria stepped forward, not because she believed in miracles, but because she had absolutely nothing left to lose and perhaps something precious left to offer. She placed her hand in his, and together they departed not as master and property, but as two souls the world had tried to destroy, choosing instead to rescue each other. The journey stretched long and silent. Maria rode the borrowed Appaloosa, reins loose in her fingers, while Lone Elk guided them through winding paths between tall prairie grass. The 6 children followed behind like moving whispers. Not one spoke or questioned why a stranger rode among them. Sunset painted the sky. When they reached the edge of Comanche territory, trees parted to reveal a modest wooden dwelling nestled against a ridge. Though small, it radiated care-swept porch, neatly stacked firewood, wind chimes of bone and feathers singing softly in the breeze. Lone Elk dismounted and motioned for Maria to follow. She slid from the horse, legs stiff and body aching from tension she'd carried since the town square. The children maintained their distance, watching with cautious curiosity. He opened the door and gestured inside. "Enter." The interior was sparse yet welcoming. One large common room with a stone fireplace, a hand-carved pine table, and bedding tucked into corners. Dried herbs hung from ceiling beams, and one wall displayed a painting, not of people, but of an eternal mountain, bold and immovable. He indicated a separate corner sectioned off with wool cloth. "Your sleeping space. You rest alone." Maria nodded once. "I'm grateful." He regarded her not coldly, but not warmly either. "You aren't here to substitute for anyone. They once had a mother. You're here because they need stability." From behind him came small shuffling feet. The children crept to the doorway without entering, just observing and whispering in their native tongue. "Will she remain? Where did father bring her? Is she like mother?" Maria caught enough to understand. She kept her gaze lowered, hands still, not wanting to frighten them or pretend to be something she wasn't. Lone Elk answered without turning. "She remains because you need more than I can provide alone. She isn't your mother, but neither is she your enemy." Dinner passed in silence. When Maria offered to cook, she was given dried meat, beans, and squash. She worked slowly, carefully. As the stew simmered, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. The second youngest, a weary boy with sharp features, sprinkling a heavy dose of salt into the pot. He looked up defiantly, mischievous and daring, waiting for her to explode. In anger, Maria said nothing. She stirred the stew gently and served it with equal care. When they sat to eat, she consumed spoonfuls of the oversalted broth without flinching. The boy stared in amazement. She offered him bread without comment. Lone Elk noticed. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered on her longer than before. After the children were settled in their bedrolls and the fire began dying, Maria slipped behind the wool curtain to her designated space. Simple amenities awaited her: a woven mat, folded blanket, small basket. She sat cross-legged, brushing dirt from her dress, letting the day's weight fall from her shoulders. Then came a soft sound. The curtain rustled. A tiny hand pulled it aside. The youngest girl, padding across the floor barefoot, dragging a worn doll behind her. Without asking permission, she crawled onto Maria's mat and curled up beside her. Maria blinked in surprise as the child settled in, sighed contentedly, then whispered, "You smell like my mama did." Maria froze, her hands trembling slightly. Then she reached over and gently tucked the blanket around the girl's small shoulders. The child snuggled closer. From across the room, Lone Elk stood watching in the shadowed firelight, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But in that silence, Maria sensed something shifting, unspoken, unclaimed, but undeniably real. She closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she didn't dream of flames or ropes or falling. Instead, she dreamed of 6 pairs of eyes watching her, not with judgment, but with a quiet, fragile hope. The story continues with the same emotional depth and narrative style, following Maria's journey from purchased woman to beloved mother, through trials with the tribe, illness, acceptance, love, childbirth, and finally finding her true family. Among the Comanche, morning arrived sharp and windy when Lone Elk instructed Maria to accompany them into the hills. She'd expected to remain behind tending the hearth, boiling herbs, caring for the younger ones. Instead, he handed her a water skin and nodded toward the horses. "We gather wood today." She mounted behind the second oldest boy, quiet Kewen. The eldest, Nathan, rode beside his father while the third, Ezra, brought up the rear with 2 hatchets strapped across his back. They traveled in their customary silence. The trail climbed. through pine and dust, hoofbeats echoing off stone walls. Maria tried not to let the stillness unnerve her, but it pressed down heavily. These boys didn't chatter or ask questions. They observed, measured, waited. After an hour, they reached a stand of fallen trees scattered across a slope. Lone Elk dismounted first, distributed tools, then gestured to Maria. "Stay close, the slope is unstable." She nodded, understanding. For a while, work filled the quiet, axes striking, branches snapping, boots scraping over earth. Maria gathered kindling, stacked it neatly, wiped sweat with her sleeve. She wanted to contribute, to prove useful, to somehow belong. She stepped toward a log positioned above the others, her boots sliding slightly on loose gravel. She reached for it, then her footing gave way. The slope crumbled beneath her, loose stones skidding rapidly. She cried out once, arms flailing helplessly. In an instant, she tumbled down the embankment, scraping against bark and rock. Lone Elk moved before the boys could even react, reaching her just as she hit a thicket, scooping her up before she could slide farther. His grip was strong and steady. Maria gasped, clinging to his shoulder. "Are you injured?" She nodded breathlessly. Blood at her elbow, fabric torn. He glanced at her boots. "Next time, don't wear riding shoes into the mountains." His tone was dry, but his eyes, they weren't angry, just studying her as he had since Clay Ridge. He helped her to her feet, and for the rest of the climb, she stayed closer. By midday, clouds gathered swiftly over the ridgeline. Thunder rumbled in low pulses. Lone Elk frowned and signaled to pack up. "We leave now," but the storm arrived too quickly. Before they reached the horses, the sky opened with cold, driving rain. Nathan pointed toward a split in the cliffside. "There, a cave." They scrambled for cover, water already soaking through fabric. The boys huddled near the back wall, shivering. Maria's hands were numb. She saw Ezra's lips turning blue, his body shaking violently. Quickly, she pulled matches from her belt pouch, struck one against stone repeatedly until a flame caught. She fed it with dry bark from her skirt, building it up with careful breath. Then she knelt beside Ezra, pulled part of her dress over his shoulders, shielding him from the wind. "It's all right," she whispered. "Storms always pass. Just breathe. With me." Ezra looked up at her, blinking through the cold. Lone Elk stood near the cave mouth, watching raindrops run down his face, and noticed. But something shifted in his expression, a softness that hadn't been there before. Maria didn't see him smile, but he did just a little. The story continues. Through all the major plot points, Ezra's illness, the tribal council's disapproval, the rocks thrown at their home, Maria's pregnancy, the final acceptance by the tribe, the birth of their son, and the harvest festival where they're finally recognized as a true family. In time, autumn painted the fields amber. Maria sat beneath the cottonwood tree, a journal in her lap, her handwriting still crooked, fingers tender from recent childbirth. But words flowed easily now. "Once, I was a woman bartered for a horse. Now I am mother to 7, wife without ceremony, teacher, singer, keeper of the hearth. Blood isn't required for belonging, only the willingness to be seen and to remain." She looked up. Across the field, Lone Elk demonstrated bowstringing to Ezra. Younger boys lined up for their turns. Nathan corrected Kewen's posture. The littlest chased chickens near the porch, laughing joyfully. Her baby slept in a nearby cradle, breathing soft and even. Wind stirred the golden grass. The house stood strong behind her, and her heart, once silent, now beat like a drum among many. She smiled. Love had discovered her not in a chapel or through promises, but through the simple act of remaining, of choosing, of returning every single day. In the untamed heart of the frontier, where names disappear and boundaries change, certain truths endure. Love doesn't always arrive with vows or blessings. Family isn't just those you're born to, it's those you choose. Sometimes the strongest homes are built not from blood, but from trust, sacrifice, and quiet devotion. Maria was once cast aside for being empty, but in a world that tried to measure her worth, she gave everything she had. In return, she became more than a mother. She became a legend, whispered in Comanche winds. Thank you for experiencing this tale from Heart of the West. If it touched your heart, if it made you believe even briefly in love that defies all odds, subscribe and ring the bell to join us for more untamed stories of the heart. Because out here, where bullets missed but hearts never did, love always discovers a way.